our guest today is Professor Galin Tihanov, and we are talking about cosmopolitanism. Hello, sir. Thank you very much for joining us. I know your works on the topic. What new ideas you're bringing with your research?
Hello, Boris. It's very good to meet you, and thank you for inviting me. I think the most important thing to realize when talking about cosmopolitanism today is that cosmopolitanism is not a homogeneous concept. There are, in fact, at least two different cosmopolitanisms. And they're not identical. They overlap in various ways, but they also diverge. The first one I would call cultural cosmopolitanism, and the second one political cosmopolitanism. But let me begin with this. Cosmopolitanism is impossible without retaining a notion of difference. Without that, cosmopolitanism slides into universalism. And the two are related, but they are not identical.
Can you please give a definition of both to distinguish?
Yes, I'll be very happy to do that. I have actually recently published a piece on this, and very briefly, cultural cosmopolitanism is about asserting, not just recognizing, but asserting and embracing difference. Difference that flows and is embodied primarily in culture and in language. And this is an idea of cosmopolitanism that is very well established. And most people, when they hear the word cosmopolitanism, this is what they imagine. Someone who is at home in more than one culture, and someone who has cultivated the ability to actually appreciate different cultures and to recognize them in their difference, not to seek to reduce them to a common denominator. Whereas political cosmopolitanism has to do with extending respect and recognizing the humanness of human beings across borders and across different cultures. So the notion of difference is equally important here. But political cosmopolitanism handles this difference differently, dissimilarly, whereas cultural cosmopolitanism wants to embrace it, assert it, and celebrate it. Political cosmopolitanism, in the end, seeks to attenuate this difference and to cultivate in us the capacity to extend respect for other human beings, regardless of who they are, where they are, what their cultural background and traditions and language. This variety, political cosmopolitanism, as I call it, begins with Kant. And it begins with Kant because Kant is the first to think about cosmopolitanism through the prism of political power. And when you read his very important work of 1796, Towards Eternal Peace, he appends to that work a very detailed list of what governments everywhere in the world should do to make sure that respect is extended to every single human being. Kant talks about this respect by actually referring to it as universal hospitality. And what he describes in this very important piece as political cosmopolitanism, and his words are cosmopolitan law, is very, very markedly different from what we call international law. International law governs the relations between states and nations. Cosmopolitan law, for Kant, regulates the relations between a state and a human being who is not a citizen of that state, a foreigner, a visitor, you might say an exile, a migrant, a refugee today. And here the difference is already there in full display. The relationship between the state and the visitor is one of inequality and difference. The state has all the power embodied in its legislation, in its institutions. The individual is powerless. The stranger knocks on the door of the state of which he or she is not a citizen, and they have to rely on the mercy of the state. This is the very heart of political cosmopolitanism. How do we recognize the other as an equally valid human being and therefore worthy of respect, even if they belong to another culture, sometimes another religion, even though they are not citizens, they don't have the right passport, and they are really referred to our kindness, the kindness of strangers to these people. This becomes a huge problem, actually, in the 20th century, particularly with the Holocaust and the wave of refugees it triggers. Hannah Arendt writes about this in a wonderful essay called We Refugees in 1943. And she spells out this philosophical problem. Why does it not suffice for a foreigner, a refugee, an exile, a migrant, to gain legitimacy solely from the fact that he or she is a human being, which is the highest attribute any of us could possess? Why do we need further legitimization, a passport, or a nationality, or a language, or a religion, which are ultimately secondary attributes compared to this most fundamental feature and attribute that we all
completely agree with this opinion. There is no real basis to justify those things that you have just listed. By virtue of being human, we have the right to use our planet in its full without the need to prove anything else, right? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, I can.
And would you agree that nationalism is the opposite side of the spectrum than cosmopolitanism?
Many people would assert that historically, actually the two are often in a dialectical relationship, and they are not as radically opposed as we tend to think of them, I will give you two examples, and they both go back to the time of Kant. In the late part of the 18th century in Germany, in German travel literature, there is a specific genre of travel writing called Cosmopolitische Wanderungen. But when you read...
Cosmopolitische Wanderung. Cosmopolitic journeys.
You might call it wanderings, but actually trips, journeys would do. But when you read these texts in the German press, in the newspapers and in the magazines, what strikes you is actually that actually these are journeys along the river Rhine from one German province to the next. They're not journeys beyond or outside of Germany, of what was to
what
become.
is now Germany was well known for many different small states.
Yeah, and these people actually, they were getting to know their fellow Germans, the different dialects, the different landscapes, gaining a notion, an extended notion of German nationhood. But to them, this extension of their knowledge, they labeled it as cosmopolitanism. They didn't label it as
but we cannot talk about German nation in 1700s.
Well, we can definitely talk about what historians call cultural nationalism, of which there are many documents at that time and a little bit later by Fichte and others. Or another example, there is a French man of letters called Mercier, and Mercier, early in the 19th century, in French, coins this notion of cosmopolitism littéraire, literary cosmopolitanism. Yeah. But when you see the essence of all this, it's all about the bilateral cultural contact and mutual enrichment between France and Germany. It's about two nations and their literatures and cultures. But essentially, it's an international phenomenon, but he thinks it already through the prism of cosmopolitanism. But it grows out of one nation beginning to discover the literature of another nation, because Mercier was the principal translator of Schiller and his plays in France. And as we know, German literature was actually not well known in France.
Well, back then, the German literature was before Goethe. Most of the literary works were written in French, even if they were written in Germany.
And I mean, not necessarily, but it is a fair point that German literature in France is properly discovered, and it begins to be properly appropriated fairly late. Madame de Stael, in this very important book of Germany, which is published actually in exile, first published in London in 1813, she says there, she addresses her fellow French men and women, and she says, if you ignore German literature, you do so at your own peril, because there is a lot in German literature that is worth reading, particularly the German Romantics. So, in other words, a lot of what we call cosmopolitanism grows actually out of national projects initially. But then there comes a point in which cosmopolitanism and nationalism really diverge, and nationalism often at that later stage becomes the enemy of cosmopolitanism.
Professor, how about to go deeper? What are actually biological roots of cosmopolitanism?
Well, I don't know if I'm qualified to search for
No,
biological.
that's an interesting thing. When we are discussing the human state, it's always advisable to look at the natural instincts that lead to that.
I mean, I cannot give you an answer grounded in physiology, but I could try an answer that is philosophical and that appeals to our human constitution. And that is to say that each of us as a human being has a desire and a yearning to be recognized as a human by others, wherever we go, wherever we are, whomever we meet, different as they might be from us, to be recognized and to be treated humanely and with respect. And the wider that zone of recognition, and the further you push the boundary of that recognition, the better. And cosmopolitanism is about this dream that eventually our being human would be recognized everywhere in the world, and we would thus feel at home everywhere in the world. Yeah, I mean, this is the original meaning of cosmopolitanism when in ancient Greece, they talk about cosmopolitanism. This is what they mean, being a citizen of the world, except for the Greeks, the world is not just a political formation, it is also the cosmos, the universe. Yeah. So nature and politics overlap for
but still, let's look at the motives. Biologically, we have two tendencies. One tendency is to be afraid of the different and alien because it poses a threat. Like a person from another tribe can kill us. A person that looks differently, speaks differently, he is threatening. Another thing is that naturally we want to enrich our genetics. And there is a certain degree of attraction to something unusual, especially on the very basic of sexual attraction. And it's a very powerful factor. So there are two opposing forces that are driving the motivation behind the love of the alien and the fear and hate of the alien. And because of those two forces, we actually can observe cosmopolitanism, because if we wouldn't be engaged in enriching our genetics, there won't be any reason for us to welcome the different person that possess a certain threat for us. That's one of the observations that can be made, admitting that humans are biological creatures and their motives, even though explained by philosophical and psychological means, very much enrooted in their biological essence.
That doesn't sound entirely implausible, and there might be a grain of truth in that. Others have said similar things, but not in biological, but in more psychoanalytical terms. There is work in psychoanalysis about the attraction and the objection of that the foreigner exercises, and there is a book, probably her best book, actually, by Julia Kristeva, called "Strangers to Ourselves," where she tries a Freudian approach to explaining foreignness. And who is a foreigner and how foreigners should be treated. And I think she is very interesting in that she actually puts in question this lucid, rational picture that Kant paints. Kant essentially says, if we all agree to behave in this rational way that I set out here in this treatise towards eternal peace, and crucially, if all governments agree to behave in this way, universal hospitality will be implemented everywhere in the world, and there will be no reason for hostility and conflict and war. But Kristeva seems to be doubting that, because she seems to be questioning our capacity to always act rationally. And so she says cosmopolitanism might be a wonderful idea or an ideal, but in fact, even when we are convinced that we should treat foreigners fairly, humanely, and with respect, sometimes unaccountable factors such as affect and emotion get in the way, and they complicate this neat scenario and this recipe that Kant gives of how we should be cosmopolitan. So yes, there are factors that go beyond the purely algorithmic, rational explanation of how we relate to difference and to foreigners. The danger in what Kristeva does, and it has been recognized, particularly on the left, is that by saying that you can explain all this psychoanalytically, she somehow releases us from our responsibility to make the effort, the very conscious effort, to treat others with respect and to recognize their humanness and their human nature at
Absolutely.
all times.
I would like also to talk about the negative connotation that cosmopolitanism has in some political, national, and cultural environments. For example, in Soviet Russia, it was a curse word. Being a cosmopolitan was very, very bad. In some other situations, it was quite similar. Right now, I believe we have quite positive connotation to this word when it's used in the Western societies. It means openness, it means curiosity, it means cultural enrichment, it means open communication between the science communities and all the positive things. Why do you think cosmopolitanism can be a threat to anything good? And why would we not support it entirely as a way out of international conflicts, misunderstandings, and so on and so on?
Yeah. Cosmopolitanism, the rejection of it usually goes hand in hand with totalitarian tendencies.
Because it is a threat for them, right?
It is a threat to them. And you gave the example of the Soviet Union, where this totalitarian trend had been firmly established by the 1930s already, and particularly in the course of the 1930s by Stalin. And we all know what happened. In 1948-49, after World War II, the Soviet Union witnessed this ugly campaign called the anti-cosmopolitan campaign, the victim of which were intellectuals who wanted to look beyond the confines
Exactly.
of the Soviet Union, and many of them were scholars of literature and history. Some of them were arrested, some of them died in incarceration. An example would be Isaac Nosinov. And just look at the chronology here. Isaac Nosinov, early in the 1940s, publishes a book called Pushkin and World Literature, which then, when it's first published, is hailed as a really important book because he places Pushkin in dialogue with other great poets and writers of world literature, with Byron as one example, and others. And so he actually inscribes Pushkin in this canon of world literature. In a sense, this is a gesture of adding significance to Pushkin's work, not diminishing his stature as a Russian poet. But when the anti-cosmopolitan campaign is unleashed, suddenly they recalled Nosinov's book, and now they arrested him for that book, because now they thought that he was actually, by placing Pushkin in this luminous tradition of world literature and staging this dialogue between him and his predecessors, he was somehow robbing him of his originality as a Russian poet and Russian.
By the way, he had Abyssinian roots.
Yes, that is true. Yes, and but you can also see this in Nazi Germany. Carl Schmitt, who was a brilliant mind, but a brilliant mind put in the services of the Nazi ideology. He has an essay in which he criticizes the League of Nations, and he talks about the League of Nations, I quote, as a cosmopolitan restaurant for which, in order for it to function, all small nations should be sacrificed as chicken are in the kitchen of a restaurant. I mean, this is very ugly. And this is this gives you a very clear idea of how totalitarian regimes deal with cosmopolitanism. But I'm afraid it's not just totalitarian regimes. I think it goes deeper than that. Cosmopolitanism is always a red flag and a source of immense irritation for most populisms. And whenever a politician begins to flirt with populism, this politician is not very far from actually returning to this condemnation of cosmopolitanism. I regret to have to give you this example, but when Theresa May was elected leader of the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom, her very first speech as leader of the Conservative Party contained this sentence: a citizen of the world is a citizen of nowhere. And I found this troubling, and I was not alone in being alarmed and disappointed by this. So populism is probably the greatest enemy of cosmopolitanism, and this goes deeper still to this simmering and brewing tension that we witness, and that increases actually.
Would you agree that it's an artificial effort to preserve the anti-cosmopolitanism in the modern world?
Well, I think it's not artificial as such, because what I was going to say, just to finish that, because it's closely related to your question that you've just asked, all this goes today to this simmering and very vociferous sometimes conflict between the elites and the rest of society. The elites are increasingly blamed for everything that goes wrong in a society, and this anti-elitist culture finds a natural ally in anti-cosmopolitanism, because very often, and we have to agree that historically there is a justification to some extent for this, very often cosmopolitanism has been a project from above. Kant is a very good example. Habermas is another example.
But now it's a grassroots movement, because
now,
the virtue of our practical lives with AliExpress, with sushi, with communicating without borders, with Google translators, with doing
now
our business everywhere. Now it's a real grassroots movement.
That is true. Increasingly, we recognize that there is also a cosmopolitanism from below, as I call it, which is which can be defined as a lifestyle and as a particular everyday culture, which you can see in shopping and fashion and tourism, and so it's embodied in acts of everyday consumption, and in a wider lifestyle. I agree with all of that, and I do think that has to be recognized and taken into account. But I still think that this is more part of the cultural cosmopolitanism that I talked about, which is about recognizing cultural difference.
We can talk about economic cosmopolitanism as well.
Perhaps. What would that look like?
That's what happens. For example, my company did a job in Great Britain. We organized line painting in some Chinese restaurant, and I made profit of £600, which is completely unlikely, because usually it's a very local job to make. I just has extended my operations everywhere because I don't really see the difference. And again and again, we can claim that we are nationalists or we support the national ideas, but the way how we practice our economic lives can be very globalistic and cosmopolitan in nature.
Yeah, cosmopolitanism doesn't necessarily need to go hand in hand with globalization. Globalization can be an ally of cosmopolitanism, but globalization also actually tends to erase a difference. And in that way, it actually erodes and compromises cosmopolitanism. We've all witnessed the spread of McDonald's and so many other
Yes,
phenomena
because it's
that
appreciation the local cultures, right?
uh, if that were the case, we would be welcoming it. But very often, actually, I think we just adopt a, a global lifestyle which invites us to do the same things everywhere in the world because that is quick, that is convenient, that is reliable, and that is not very adventurous. That is not necessarily a synonym for
Can I say a
making
very radical thing? Maybe national significance is overrated. Look at Great Britain, for example. Very few people can in Wales can speak their own language, or in areas like Scotland, very few know their own languages. It can be a beautiful thing for museums and holidays, but it's very inconvenient for the day-to-day life. And every time when this is the reason for the separatist movements, it always damages the common well-being, because we know every time when the countries are getting broken into separate pieces, they face way more problems than they faced when they were united. And separatism in any way is always the opportunity for the local elites to gain more power than they usually would have as a federal subject or as a part of a bigger structure. People are duped and they do not benefit from this thing. And even very successful countries like UK and Canada, they are suffering from separatist movements. Like we do have Quebec that trying to get separated, and even in 1970 it went as far as to killing hostages and bringing the military and the tanks into Montreal. I do believe that separatist movements in the democratic countries where all the rights of the citizens are equally observed is an absurd and very threatening thing, and always supported from outside. Because when you see any way to weaken your partner or your competitor, you will see as an opportunity to support the separatist movement to make your enemy or competitor weaker. I also would like to say you are referring a lot to Kant and to 18th and 19th century. I believe that the world was, in terms of diversity, the world was very different from today's world. We are all very similar right now. Even traveling to the very distant countries and even distant cultures, we still meet the things that we're used to. in our own lands, like ATM machines, like banking. Yes, we will face different names for these things. And even in British English-speaking nations, in different countries, we will name things differently. But that maybe as much as the difference goes. We are way more homogenic than we used to be. And now being cosmopolitan is not that difficult and it used to be. I consider
I'm not
myself like,
sure.
yes.
I mean, I'm not entirely sure. Yes, it is true that the world has come together because of technology, primarily.
Also
But
because of the desire of people to benefit from the mutual cooperation. And that's why we all speak English. So English is not your mother tongue, right?
no,
Neither mine. But we all came together to learn the language, Franca, to communicate, right?
but I still insist on this differentiation between cultural and political cosmopolitanism, because political cosmopolitanism requires a certain effort of leaving behind prejudice, of extending respect consistently, of recognizing the humanity of the other. And look at, again, Nazi Germany is a very good example, and I've written about this. And look at these highly cultivated Nazi functionaries who would listen at home to classical music and would read extensively, um, and would be probably, culturally speaking, very cultivated and refined, with a cultural baggage that extends far beyond the confines of German culture. But in the morning, they would leave their homes and they will go and sign decrees for the
I
Jews to
believe
be
that's the
murdered.
problem of any ideology. You don't have to
Well,
be a Nazi to act in a very negative sense. We remember how Christianity got to the Inquisition, and actually the Crusades, which actually destroyed their fellow Constantinople.
but my point is that you can be a cultural cosmopolitan without being a political cosmopolitan, and actually also vice versa. You mentioned Canada, and Canada is probably a great example of. I mean, we don't talk as much in the West these days as we used to until some years ago. This entire notion of multiculturalism, but Canada embodies multiculturalism. That multiculturalism, to me, is not the same as cosmopolitanism, because cosmopolitanism really requires us to embrace and assert and salute.
I agree with you because I
Multiculturalism
experience.
is actually based on respect for everyone. This is the political cosmopolitanism, but it doesn't require you to participate and to get to know
Exactly. I
and to
completely agree
engage
with you.
with the culture of the other.
I
So this is
agree.
an example where you can be a political cosmopolitan without being a cultural cosmopolitan.
Exactly. And I would like to support what you say. I'm in Canada for 22 years. And I would say that multiculturalism actually separates people because we live in separate communities. And in Toronto, there are 45% of the immigrants. So in some areas, you will never see the locals local Canadians. You will bump into immigrants only. And their communities are very separated. You live in a little world of Russian community, Persian community, and they don't mix. They don't mix.
Yes, I mean, commentators on multiculturalism, also from the left, they've always been concerned about this, that multiculturalism actually leads to mosaic, peaceful but mosaic coexistence of different communities and different
But I
cultures.
do believe we need
and they
to,
all have their parallel lives.
yes,
They
but
don't
I do believe
intersect
we need to
often.
let people live as they like, as they please, as they feel comfortable.
That is very important.
We
In the
shouldn't
end,
impose on them any ideology or any notion, or shouldn't push them in any direction.
no, exactly. This is why I keep saying that political cosmopolitanism you can, in a sense, mandate from above through legislation, for example. But cultural cosmopolitanism has to be cultivated as a matter of private commitment, which is not regulated by legislation or by decrees from above. So if you want to mix with others, and if you want to get to know their culture deeper and eventually to participate in that in one way or another, you can do that, but no one can actually order you to do that.
Professor, let's imagine we enter the time machine and we are in the year 2122, in 100 years. Do you think that the ideas of cosmopolitanism will be still adequate for the society in 100 years?
Who knows? I think
Or it will be so homogenic that it will be absolutely out of the question.
I see this from a slightly different perspective. I think for as long as actually our concern about being human remains paramount, cosmopolitanism will continue to be an important value and a set of values that we may choose to adhere to. The pressure and the challenges, I think, are more linked to this growth of transhumanism and technologies
Exactly.
that actually gradually begin to oust this traditional notion of the central place that being human occupies in our lives. So it's not just about robots, it's actually about extending human life medically, technologically, transforming human capacity.
By the way,
And
by
technologically.
extending human lives, we actually make the progress of our mentality to slow down. When the previous generation lives longer, it keeps its traditional views in the society way longer than in times when they would die 20 years earlier.
I've once been reflecting on a similar question, and I've written about this, but this borders on science fiction in a sense. We have to be very honest about this. But if we imagine a human life being extended into certainly beyond the point when one reaches 100. Eventually, over a longer period of time, I think this will lead to a transformation in how generational memory operates. Because I think culture very much operates through a consensus on identifying important points that actually bind together different generations and help them communicate with one another. Now, these important points are usually identified vis-a-vis a horizon of individual human existence, biological existence. And when this horizon is extended significantly, and when this reality of an extended biological horizon is entrenched over many decades, I think the perspective on what is significant and what is less so would also shift. And this would impact on how we see history and its importance, on how we formulate our objectives, and how we pursue them. And I think this is a question for the future. Right now, it is still a question of a sci-fi, probably more than
Absolutely.
proper
Professor, I would like to thank you for very insightful conversation. I do believe that this topic is has utmost importance. Based on this topic, we can explain a lot of serious social and political issues that we still face in our world. And I think that your research is adding up to the progress in those questions, and it's very important. And I'm very glad you have chosen these topics for your scientific work. And I would like to commend you for your input that you have done in this area of knowledge. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on your program.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.